El micro.
Vale, perdón.
Excuse me. My microphone was muted. I would like to welcome you all to this presentation with Nerea Zorokian. It's an introduction to fermentation. And Nerea, thank you very much for being here with us today. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. At Fundesplai, we are very happy to have you here with us today because we believe that fermentation and microorganisms and digestive health is a very interesting topic and very unknown. And we are hoping to learn a lot this evening with you. And we're also very happy because we believe that we share the same vision of human health that is very much intertwined with nature, the environment, and our social environment. And it's important also to think about how important it is to look after the planet and the environment. At Fundesplai, we have been working for a long time on promoting actions that help overcome the climatic and social challenges that we face today. We have conducted many activities in this regard. We have an exhibition in the Prat area, and we have also conducted different education activities at schools and other education centers, and we've also organized some presentations on this topic, and yours forms part of this cycle called Eat Life. It's a European project, and the goal is to promote meeting the goals of the European Green Deal, because there is a specific part that it's called From the Farm to the Table that has as a goal to reduce the impact of food and ensure food sustainability so that we can have a fairer food system that is also healthier and more sustainable. And we'd like to tell the participants that we're going to have a questionnaire at the end of this presentation so that you tell us your opinion, because it's very important to us and also important for the European Commission so that we can continue improving our actions. And we will give you this questionnaire at the end of the presentation on the chat. And during the second half of this presentation, you will be able to ask questions to Nerea. So if you have any questions, if you think of any questions, you can already write them down on the question section that you have at the bottom, not on the chat. And without further ado, I will introduce you to Nerea, who is an expert in fermentation processes, and she disseminates her knowledge through different channels, through courses, presentations, and the social media. And she has also 2 books on this topic. And one of them, in fact, is very recent. That is Probiotic Cooking. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Nerea, and thank you for being here with us. I'd like to thank you and the Fundesplai Foundation. I love your introduction because at an environmental level, we tend to look at the macro level, but I'm specialized in the micro level, and I think it's also important to understand bacteria because they were the first creatures on Earth, and they'll probably be the last, and we have a lot to learn from them. And through the fermentation processes, we can understand better bacteria, and we can understand better this micro world that we see through the microscope. And at home, we can start these fermentation processes that have always existed, and we can create a relationship with these microorganisms. And fermentation is a way of understanding these small microorganisms. It's like having a garden of Tamagotchis or little creatures. And the European Union is promoting these actions and the importance of microorganisms. So I'm very happy to be here today with you. I will start my presentation. Firstly, it's important to understand the different types of ferments that exist. And if you have any questions or doubts, please write them down, because I'll be very happy to answer them at the end of my presentation. And if you have any doubts, as I say, I'll be very, very happy to answer them. I'm trying to go to the next slide. All right, now, first of all, sometimes we think that fermentation is something new because many people are fermenting something at home. Before, if you spoke about fermented foods, it seemed that it was something that had gone off and in the fridge. And there was this idea in the last century that bacteria were attacking us and that are very dangerous, but it's the opposite. 99% of them are good. And there are some processes that have been used since the Neolithic, and that is the fermentation processes. And we use them. This process was used because it helps preserve food. Because in the past, whoever had salt had the capacity of preserve food. And in a world where there were no fridges, no way of refrigerating food, and where you didn't have fresh foods during certain seasons, then there was a lack of nutrients, and that led to diseases. But whoever had the salt had the power to preserve the food, and it was important to have salt at home. And the fermentation processes already started in the Neolithic, and the goal was to preserve foods. And with fridges, then this process disappeared a little bit. It's difficult to understand now how things worked before in the past, but in the Navarra area near the Pyrenees, the temperature can be minus 18 degrees Celsius, and there are no vegetables in the garden. So fermentation was a way of preserving vegetables. We have this use of fermentation as a preservation process, and there is a symbiosis between the microorganisms in the jar and humans. So we also know that every culture has its own traditional fermented foods depending on the area. For example, in the Mediterranean, you see brine. In the north, you see more fermentation with water. In Asia, there are some fermentations that are 500 years old, but every culture in the world has its own fermentation processes with original recipes. And this is wonderful, because this means that there is this culture of fermentation, that it did exist in the past, because it was the only way of preserving food. And there's a very interesting story that refers to the boats that would leave from Germany, and they had chucrut. And as they had chucrut, in that way, they could prevent scurvy. The sailors didn't die from scurvy. So, as I mentioned before, now fermentation has a different concept, because in the past we used to hear that something that was fermented meant that it was some food that had gone off. But when we talk about fermentation, what's really important is to understand that we're transforming food. We are creating some kind of vegetable garden. We are creating different types of ecosystems that have certain conditions so that these beneficial microorganisms can grow. Therefore, they need food, they need to have the right temperature, and they need to be able to proliferate. They need space to proliferate, to multiply. So we create these appropriate conditions, and the food that has been fermented, this can be a vegetable or a beverage or nuts or flour. So what the microorganisms do is grow through their own metabolism in the same way as humans, who are born, reproduce themselves, and then die. So the microorganisms grow and transform the food. With water and flour, we have some sourdough. With milk and lactobacillus, we have a yogurt. For example, a fermented apple juice becomes cider. So this means that there is some microorganisms that are growing because they are in the right environment. And well, as I was saying, apple juice becomes cider, or water and flour become bread. And usually we see that these foods have prebiotics. They have the appropriate characteristics for the microorganisms to multiply. They are like the little homes of bacteria, as if the bacteria had a hotel where to grow. And many fermented foods become probiotics. So some become prebiotics and some become probiotics. And they're very similar to what we have in our digestive system. A probiotic food is probiotic when its microorganisms are the same as the ones we have in our microbiome. All right? In this way, we have a food with microorganisms and a food that has the capacity of creating a home in that ferment and creating a home that helps the bacteria to multiply and proliferate. Because people talk about taking probiotics, but we already have our own microbiota that needs to be fed. And within the different fermented foods, because not all of them have all these benefits, but these are the main benefits of fermented elements, food. I meant there are different types of fermented foods, and some are ultra processed. It's not the same to have a yogurt that you make at home or that is organic than an ultra processed yogurt that may have been pasteurized, and therefore the microorganisms have been killed. So it's important to eat good quality fermented foods so that they can offer us all these benefits. Here we have a list of these benefits. Not all fermented foods have all these benefits, as I said before, but these are the main ones. Firstly, they're rich in vitamins B and C. Chucrut has more vitamin C than kiwi, almost 200 times more than kiwi. and also vitamin B for vegan people. If B12 is present in a certain vegetable, that's a good source of vitamin B. Additionally, fermented food helps us digest food better in general. Some fermented foods help with our digestion because of the acid they contain, because it's very similar to the acid that we have in our stomach, and it's also similar to the acid we have in our bile. There are different fluids that are acid and that are similar to the acidity of fermented foods. For example, if you combine a fermented food such as chucrut with a fried food, that's a very good combination because that helps digest better fat. And I always say animals have survived sausages because they always eat them. So in Germany, in Germany, the fact that they have survived to eating so many sausages because they combine these sausages with chucrut. And we have to think that 80% of our immune system is in our digestive system. And the two things we put into our body are oxygen and food, because our kidneys have no contact with anything from the outside, neither does the heart. So you have to bear in mind that the immune system is mostly in the stomach to be able to fight any dangers from the outside. Therefore, as we have a large part of our immune system in our stomach, we are adding more bacteria so that our immune system can fight against any pathogens or most pathogens. If we have a good immune system with good bacteria, it'll be easier then to recover from any type of infection. And it also helps with the balance of the digestive system. For example, if you have diarrhea or constipation, it's always good to have a yogurt with probiotics. But the same is applicable to fermented foods, because fermented foods also regulate the microbiota. As I said, they help digest fat better, and they contain antioxidants so that it helps cleanse the blood and the skin. And when you start eating fermented foods, you often see the effect on the skin, and it helps eliminate toxins. And fermented foods also help alkalize the body. The question is, how can an acid food help alkalize the stomach? Well, it's a chemical process, because we believe that acid foods will create acidity and alkaline foods will alkalize our stomach. But we have to think that our stomach has a very low acidity. And if our digestive system doesn't work much, then it will be very alkaline. Or if it works too much, it will be too acid. And as fermented foods are easier to digest, then we can help alkalize our stomach. It also avoids heartburn, and it helps absorb minerals. And I once had an iron excess, and when I went to the doctor asked me if I ate a lot of meat. I said no, and he wouldn't believe it because my iron levels were very high thanks to fermented foods. Now, I am going to explain some practical aspects of the different types of fermentations available and how they can be done. And if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them at the end of my presentation. So there are many different type of fermented foods. Firstly, we have fermented vegetables that are transformed through microorganisms, and we have a brine, and I've mentioned chucrut. There's also kimchi and other foods that may sound strange, but we should remember pickles and aubergines and olives because they are part of our culture in our country. And 100 years ago, before using water and salt, what they did was to create pickles, because in that way it was easier to sell. Because when you use just brine, then you get a layer on top that people, well, don't like so much. But using water and salt is a traditional way of fermenting foods such as olives, and this is something we can see today in Morocco and in other northern African countries. Also, lemons and other foods. We also have beverages such as cider. And I'm sure that many of you today have heard about kombucha. When I was little, and when I was about 10, my mother had at home water kefir. Then it disappeared, but it's coming back. And apart from alcoholic beverages that wouldn't be considered probiotics, there are some fermented beverages that are probiotics. And then we have the fermentation of pulses and cereal, such as bread, because cereal is fermented and bread is the clearest example. You should bear in mind that this is something very cultural, and I will explain afterwards why bread is fermented or what is its basis. And within pulses and nuts, we have vegan cheese, for instance. And when we are putting in water the pulses for 24 hours instead of just 6 hours, then a fermentation process starts. In fact, if you have trouble digesting pulses and you have the possibility of letting them ferment, then you will realize that they are easier to digest. And another typical fermentation process is that of vinegar. My grandmother, when she saw that there was a bottle of wine that was turning bitter, then she would use it to create vinegar. And for all these fermentation processes, we see different microorganisms involved. At the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned that every fermented food has a different type of microorganism. What we need to do is to create a home for these microorganisms to live. For example, the yeast of sourdough doesn't need any salt, for example. Salt is something you would use for brine. So whenever we're going to start with fermenting foods, first we have to focus on the type of food and the type of microorganism that we want to obtain. Imagine that you have different plants at home. Some prefer more sun, and that's why you have them on the terrace. Some need more water than others. So imagine each of these fermentation processes with its own characteristics, with its own microorganisms. They need the right environment to grow properly, because if they don't grow, it's because they don't get the right food or the right temperature. Therefore, this is something we have to remember. We are going to start now with fermented vegetables. I'm a fan of fermented vegetables. I think that they are the most interesting fermented foods for our digestive system, because what we can grow in a jar of fermented vegetables is similar to what we have in our stomach, because it has prebiotics, and that's the home where the microorganisms will grow. So the bacteria of our digestive system have this new home to live. And then we have the probiotics that grow in the vegetables. And then we have all the postbiotics, the residue of the fermentation process. And they are nutrients that are really interesting for us. Postbiotics are not often mentioned, but it's important to eat the residue of these microorganisms. Fermented vegetables are obtained through the lactic acid bacteria and have nothing to do with dairy products. What they create through their metabolic system is lactic acid. And when we ferment a vegetable in 2 weeks, it has an acid flavor like that of vinegar. And these bacteria need the hydrocarbons of the vegetables and the fiber that we are not able to digest. And they also need a small quantity of salt. So we shouldn't add too much salt, because then we will be obtaining another type of bacteria. We're talking about a 2 or 3% of salt to prepare the fermented vegetables, so that the lactic acid bacteria grow, that help recover the digestive system because of the probiotics and postbiotics. And for an appropriate growth of fermented vegetables, there should be a limited oxygen flow or no oxygen at all. And this is important, because if there is an oxygen flow, then yeast can grow. And if you know that yeast properly, then you can like it. But many people don't like that white layer of yeast that appears on the surface. And what we need to ferment vegetables is just vegetables, salt, and a jar. And remember that in the Neolithic, they already created fermented vegetables. And today, with all the tools we have available, it's very easy. First of all, we are going to cut the vegetables. We're going to add the appropriate quantity of salt. So I'm sure that many of you know how to calculate the solution rate. If you add salt to a vegetable, they start to release water, but of course, each vegetable has its own quantity of water. And what we need is a 2% of salt for the whole water quantity. So it's a 2% per kilo. If you cut a cauliflower and you weigh it, for every kilo of cauliflower, you would add 20 grams of salt. And we will put this in a jar. And I want the jar to be full so that we limit the oxygen flow. For example, if it's a jar this size, if it's a jar like this, if we only have vegetables at the bottom, then we have all this part with oxygen. So that's why we need to fill up the jars with the vegetables and to leave the jar at room temperature so that the fermentation process starts, and then the metabolic process will begin and bacteria will start eating up the vegetables and will start to multiply and create different types of microorganisms. And depending on the phase of fermentation, there'll be different types of microorganisms, and there'll be also different types of acids and residue. And among the residue, we have CO2. That's the bubbles, for example, that you get in a bottle of champagne. And if the jar is airtight, then when you open it, then it can like explode like a champagne bottle. So all the vegetables should be covered by the liquid, everything should be covered by the brine. The brine is preserving those vegetables. This is the governing fluid. That's the name it gets. So it's really important. All the vegetables need to be covered in water, and we just need to leave the jar there. It's like plants. You have to see whether they need changing places. We can open and close the jar, but we are going to leave that jar there for 2 or 3 weeks, and depending on the temperature, because if it's hot, then they grow much more quickly. However, when it's cold, the bacteria fall asleep and grow much slower. So the fermentation process in summer can last 10 days, but in winter it can last 30 days, all right? Once 2 or 3 weeks have elapsed, then we do close properly the jar, then it should be airtight, and then we can preserve those vegetables for months and months and months. Remember that in the past, they would be preserved for the whole winter or for years. I remember eating this year vegetables that I fermented when I wrote my first book. That was a jar, the jar that I used for the cover of the book. And that was 3 years ago when I wrote the book. So that means that you can have your fermented vegetables keeping well for a long time. And you can keep them as long as you like, but you should remember that they're not going to be having more beneficial characteristics because you're waiting longer to open it. All right, just enjoy it whenever you feel like enjoying it. All right. And of course, it's important that you like the flavor, that you enjoy this flavor, and so that you get also the benefits when you eat these foods. All right, now let's go to the next process. And if you have any questions, please let me know at the end of the presentation. Now, fermented beverages. This is one of the most common fermentations. In fact, every culture has its own fermented alcoholic beverage because alcohol didn't exist, spirits didn't exist in the way we know them today. So fermented beverages exist everywhere. And I'm going to mention some. I remember, for example, the other day that I was talking to someone, and it's wonderful because the more you talk to people, the more you learn. And there was someone who told me that if in your porridge you spit at night and then you eat it the next day, it's sweet. And why is it sweet? Because in our spit, we have in our saliva, we have amylase. And when we spit into our porridge at night, then it changes the process. So to ferment drinks, what they did in the past was to chew hydrocarbons and spit them in the beverage. For example, chicha, yuca is chewed. So there are many things that can be done thanks to our body's biochemistry. And one of the things that I like best about fermented beverages, of course, we have alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages. The non-alcoholic ones are more interesting for our body because they won't impact the liver. And the best thing about fermented beverages is that it's a good way of introducing people to fermentation processes, because maybe chucrut or kimchi can be more difficult for someone who loves meat and doesn't like vegetables, but a fermented drink is easier. For example, for children who may find fermented vegetables difficult to eat, but uh, for example, you can make a mandarin kombu, and this kombucha, this mandarin kombucha is just wonderful. And my children say that it's like orange Fanta, and they give it to their friends when they come home. So of course, water is the healthiest drink, but fermented drinks are also very healthy and very interesting. Many of them are probiotics, such as kombucha, water kefir, natural soda, water. And you have to remember that if you open an alcoholic drink during fermentation, the ethanol evaporates. But if you keep it close, so you have the same fermentation process for cider or for an apple soda. And the only difference is the exposure to oxygen, all right? Because different microorganisms grow. And then we have a shrub. Shrub is a wonderful drink. It's really interesting. It has a different flavor. And for example, I don't really drink any alcohol and I don't take any sugar. So for me, to drink something special means drinking very often fizzy water with some lemon when I go to a restaurant. But it's wonderful to have this type of drinks such as shrub. Shrub is very typical in England. And it has a very different flavor. It's vinegar. It's acid. I think it's good. It tastes good. Then there's kvass as well. It's called kvass in Russia, Kvass, and it's made with vegetables and salt. And it's very bitter. It's a very bitter drink. It's surprising. It's trying something else, very different from all the sweet soda that we're used to or alcoholic drinks. And the first question you need to look at when you're going to ferment drinks is firstly, what type of drink do you want? Because each beverage, each drink has its own needs. For example, kombucha. What do we need for kombucha? We need sugar and tannins. So usually we take tea, red tea, white tea, green tea, any kind of tea. But it has to be from the Camellia sinensis variety. And it has many tannins. And also it uses water. It has an important level of yeast. And it's very easy to make kombucha. You just need to make some tea, let it cool, add sugar, and let it grow. And we always leave a small quantity to continue feeding it. So you are recycling a small part of the drink. It's like cutting the branches of a tree, eating those branches and letting the tree grow more branches. And it's a process that lasts about 15 days. We also have the water kefir and the SCOBY, that is symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. It's like an ecosystem of bacteria and yeast. And we always need to keep a small quantity. In the case of kombucha, we will have a layer at the top of bacteria that protects the drink. And in the case of water kefir, it uses water and sugar, and will get these very soft and see-through little stones. They're not stones, but they look like little stones. And when you feed it, it reproduces, and it helps the bacteria grow. And this means that the fermentation is appropriate. Then we have soda water. You just need something with yeast, and any organic fruit has yeast. You don't need to buy any yeast. You just need to make a juice with the peel and add some sugar and water. And in this way, you get some soda. And then we also have other types of drinks, such as Reca, which is made with juniper and sugar. So we need fruit that has hydrocarbons. For example, if we have banana plus strawberries, strawberries have yeast, then together we can have a banana soda water. And this is something that has been done by humans for ages, and we have all these products available in nature. There's also the fermentation of nuts and cereal. Here on this slide, you see this almond vegan cheese, and the penicillium is a very small yeast that we feed. It can grow in dairy products, but also in almonds. So it's a very small fungus. And bread is also fermented cereal. And the goal in this type of fermentation process is not to obtain so much probiotics, but the digestion of food. And I'm giving you the example of bread because many people are gluten intolerant. And I have to say that food is made up of different molecules. And these molecules are in chains. And once we separate each part of the chain, each piece of the chain, then it can be assimilated properly. If not, it cannot be assimilated properly. So it's important to be able to separate each piece of these molecule chains. And this is what is known as food intolerance. But when we have a fermentation process, what we do is digest the nutrients outside the digestive system. So the flour that has gluten is pre-digested outside through the sourdough, because then the gluten is decomposed. And when you eat that bread, what we're doing is giving our digestive system something that is easier to digest. If you haven't fermented this previously outside, then your body cannot tolerate it properly. And this is what happens with wheat and other cereal. So this type of pre-digestion, the main benefit is the pre-digestion of nutrients. And the same is applicable to pulses. When you leave pulses in water for 24 hours, because there are many people who find difficult to digest pulses, but if you do this pre-digestion process outside, then pulses are easier to digest. And the same is applicable to nuts because of the fat they have. Sometimes they're difficult to digest. However, with the pre-digestion process that we obtain through fermentation, then these foods are easier to digest. So with the fermentation processes, the goal is that pre-digestion. And this is the case of sourdough or tempeh or natto or yogurts, because some people are intolerant to milk but not to yogurts. Then we have vegan cheese. So it's food that has been fermented and therefore it's easier to digest afterwards by our digestive system. So it has helped us with the separation of each link of the molecule chain. Then we also have vinegar. Vinegar is easy to make. What is important is to have good quality vinegar. Very often, vinegar is not considered as important as it should, because it helps, for example, control sugar levels, and it's not the same to have living vinegar that you create at home than a dead vinegar, so to speak. So we're talking about the transformation of our alcoholic drink of 5 to 10 degrees of alcohol. It shouldn't have too much alcohol. And the bacteria involved here are the BAA, the acetic acid bacteria. In vegetables, we were talking about lactic acid, and here we are referring to BAA, to the acetic acid bacteria. And vinegar is bitter wine. And it's wine, well, that has turned bitter. There are many different types of vinegar, depending on the raw material used. We can have cider vinegar, wine vinegar, tomato vinegar, fruit vinegar. You can make vinegar out of anything, because from any type of food you can obtain an alcoholic drink, and you can obtain vinegar from any type of alcoholic drink. How do we ferment vinegar? First of all, we need a beverage with sugar. It can be a juice from any type of fruit, and the process is an anaerobic process with no oxygen, because if there is no alcohol, then the acetic acid bacteria cannot feed themselves because they feed from alcohol. You cannot make vinegar without using an alcoholic drink. So we need a beverage with sugar so that it produces alcohol through fermentation. And depending on the quantity of sugar, we'll have more or less quantity of alcohol. This process has to be anaerobic, i.e. with no oxygen. When an alcoholic drink with 5 to 10 degrees of alcohol, when exposed to oxygen, then the acetic acid bacteria can smell the vinegar and start eating that alcoholic drink. With cider, for example, when you make your own cider, you are creating food for the acetic acid bacteria because they need oxygen and they start eating the alcohol. And the alcohol is transformed into acetic acid bacteria. It's easier to make vinegar in a jar with a wide opening than in a jar or bottle with a small opening. All right, so the bigger the opening, the faster the process. And once we have that vinegar with the acidity we want, then we can bottle it and we can preserve it without oxygen, airtight. And to end my presentation, I think it's very important to understand that we are not just what we eat, but we are what we are able to assimilate, because we may think that we eat well, but we're not assimilating properly the food we eat because our digestive system is not in good condition. So the condition of our digestive system shows how our body is, and microorganisms are key for our digestive system to work properly. It's very important to love bacteria and to take care of bacteria and to understand how important they are, because 99.9% of bacteria are beneficial. So we have to become friends with bacteria. It's also important to remember that 20% of the world foods are fermented foods. Well, that's all. That's my presentation for today. I hope you liked it, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much, Nerea. It's been very, very interesting. It may seem like a difficult topic, however, you have explained it very, very well. It's been very easy to understand. I'm looking forward to start with my own fermentation processes to start creating my own fermented foods. We don't have much time left for questions because we should end in 4 minutes. But I have one question for you. Do you have any key recommendation to start fermenting food? Which would be like the star product to start? Well, any vegetable. I always start with roots because they have more microorganisms because they've been in contact with the earth. For example, carrots or cauliflower. And I have many channels through which I share my knowledge. There's also my book, and I'm always available to answer any questions because I just want people to start fermenting. So that's where you can get more information. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nerea. We are going to share with the participants the video of this presentation and also the links of your social media and of your channel so that they can get more information on this topic. Here on the chat now, you also have the questionnaire, the assessment questionnaire, the survey, so that you can answer it. That will be very useful for us. And thank you, Nerea. Thank you very much for being here today. And I'd like to thank the participants also for joining us here today. And we hope to see you soon in the next events we organize. I would also like to thank the audience and Fundesplai. I am very happy to have been able to do this presentation today and enjoy your fermentation. Thank you. Goodbye.